All right, this is Sorry for Rambling. I'm Alex Kack, and I have with me today Salem Snow. He's running for Congress out of Pennsylvania's 2nd District. Salem, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Pleasure is definitely on my end. Let's jump in. Why are you running?
So, my background is I grew up in poverty in government subsidized housing with my single mother and my siblings. So, financial pressure was always a factor growing up. We were in a disadvantaged neighborhood and in a pretty bad position. And I think that coupled with the recent aggressive gentrification in our area is what really pushed me to actually run, especially since the developers here in Philadelphia and in other big cities have pretty much taken over, got a lot of aggressive gentrification that causes displacement. And here it's happening at an alarming rate. And when that started happening in our area, our neighborhood kind of organized and tried to fight back. I'm sure you can imagine how well that went with a millionaire developer. But that process, I was the one that was reaching out to politicians at the time and trying to get help. And the more I looked into them, the more I figured out that there was no help. And that's what really pushed me to be like, okay, like if nobody else is going to take on this kind of corruption, like somebody's got to do it. So that's how I ended up where I'm at.
I mean, that's it's a hell of a story. To be honest with you, we're facing these issues all over the country right now. We are in a national rent crisis. There's no way around it. And I mean, it's hitting renters, it's hitting homeowners even, and positively and negatively. But it is. I mean, people are really being priced out. Uh, which makes me kind of curious. I mean, do you think that this is an issue that should be handled at kind of a local level, community by community, or do you think this is something where we need broad national action?
Um, Actually, both. What I've been proposing as part of my platform is what I call community rights, which would be basically pushed through federally as federal law, but allows for communities to basically veto developments that are being built in their districts via democratic vote.
Okay, so it's almost like kind of creating national framework for local action to happen with. Am I understanding that correctly?
Absolutely.
I feel like you don't see enough legislation, at the federal level that's based on empowering local communities like that. We see subsidies and we see grants sometimes, but nothing that kind of brings it down to that community, individual level like that. Are there other things that you feel that model can apply to?
Sure. I actually find that one thing that I feel independents, Republicans, and Democrats all have in common is that they're all very pro community. With the GOP, you see them pushing for a lot of small government. Um, and I believe on a community level, that's actually pretty healthy and democratic. But I feel like there's a lot of different things that could actually be handled community by community. I do think there's definitely need for federal legislation, of course, for things like regulation, ensuring that living wages or thriving wages are allowed for all workers, the right to unionize, etc. Like those are what I would view federal issues that need to be like a blanket sort of like rules, and then specifics can be handled by community, and that's one reason why I feel like we need to sort of take this working class empowerment, because the way things are set up right now is that officials are the ones that really make all the decisions. And sometimes, or actually very often, officials don't accurately represent their constituents, and the constituents can get screwed in situations like this, like with gentrification and development. So I think we should be moving more policies towards self empowerment of communities to let them kind of handle these things democratically.
I mean, I couldn't probably agree with you more in that sense. So I mean, it sounds like this is kind of a key issue for you. But what are some other issues that are important to you as a politician, as someone who's stepping into the political arena?
So I think one of the biggest things that we're dealing with right now is climate change. I think that's undeniable. And that's actually what I've got as my number one issue, just because if we accomplish every other progressive goal, but we but we don't implement a Green New Deal of some form, then we're going to lose the planet and all of humanity to mass destruction from climate war, basically. And it kind of takes away meaning from getting anything else accomplished if you can't save the planet and have people to provide all these things for. So climate is definitely a big one that I think I'm glad it's getting traction more in recent years, but I feel like it's been ignored for so long and that we've let it go for so long that now we have to go for a last minute save or it's not going to happen at all.
I mean, let's be honest. That's exactly where we're at. The climate thing is so frustrating because you look back 30 years ago, 35 years ago, and things were not as polarized in regards to our understanding of the climate crisis. There was bipartisan, kind of across the political spectrum, understanding that this was that this was impending doom.
Right.
Uh, Frankly, um, but action wasn't taken. It was just kicked down the road, and now we're in this situation where we have a litany of different ideas on how we should address it in one party, and then we have a whole kind of other party that just believes in conspiracy theories and kind of fantasy. How do you address that? I mean, let's say you get elected. How do you first whip the votes in your own party and then whip votes in the opposition?
It's a great question. Um, First, and as with most political issues, I find that this is really going to fall on voters getting the right people into Congress, getting the right people in positions of power who can legislate something meaningful to tackle climate change. Um, because at the end of the day, if we elect a couple of the right people and not enough people in Congress to effectively pass anything, we're still not doing anything. So I think the groundwork for that, unfortunately, falls on organizers on local levels, voters to know who they're voting for and make sure that they're getting the best climate candidates in right now. And once we get to that point, which hopefully will be, this cycle, because I really feel that if we don't do something in the next cycle electorally, that we might be going past a point of no return. So I think first it relies a lot on getting the right people into Congress who can push through the right legislation to tackle this. And then whipping the vote should be easy. That would be the ideal. If we're in a situation where we're going to have to work across the aisle, then that's something we're going to have to take head on with the Republicans. It's actually kind of really astounding that so many of them still take these conspiracy theories and peddle them through so many voters and on so many platforms. Like, it's really dangerous because we're in the last few years to actually do something. And after that, like, it's done. Like, this should really be a top priority for everyone.
You know, and this I'm going to take a very dark turn here, but this is something I haven't heard any elected officials really talk about. One, I'll say this: one, there has been kind of a turn towards futurism in this election cycle in the Democratic Party. In regards to climate, prevention or response at this point, maintenance, whatever you want to call it, in this part of the disaster. But things we see with like Andrew Yang and his kind of obsession with automation and robotics. This a lot of this stuff sounds like science fiction still to the average American, but but it's not. It's right around the corner if we're not careful. One thing I have not heard any politicians say is, let's say we fail. Let's say we don't pass a Green New Deal or any meaningful climate action, and let's say that we are faced right off that cliff. What does that look like from a policy perspective? You know, it's going to kill lots of people. It's not going to kill everybody. There's still going to be framework in place. What do we do after that? And I haven't seen leaders talking about that and any sense of preparedness.
So if we get to that point, and you're right, it's actually kind of scary how much officials have, first of all, ignored climate change as a whole, and second of all, like you said, like ignored what happens if we go past that, because it's a very real possibility at this point. And I think at that point, what we're going to have to start looking for is ways to adapt to the kind of post-apocalyptic future we've created. And at that point, we're going to have to really push our technology, really push all of our resources to the max to really see if there is any way to, save what's left. Whether that means, going underground, whether it means building, I guess, sort of like shelters to deal with the climate and all the heat. But if we do go past the point of no return, I'm honestly not even sure that there is anything we could do, at least permanently, that would solve anything by then. Which is why it's so important to work now on prevention and recovery.
It's an interesting, I think, take. It's honestly, it's not a thought I'd had until I was having this conversation right now with you. But it is something that now I'm thinking about it. I mean, disaster kind of response preparedness. That was something that was a common part of governmental procedure and policy in the mid 20th century. And just these hypothetical situations. We prepared for nuclear war. We prepared for the asteroids. Even on a smaller scale, natural disasters. And this, even kind of kookier out there things. These were things that money was spent on to figure out how we could keep the citizenry safe as long as possible. And this wasn't just the U.S. The UK did this. China, the USSR. This was a focus point of the last century that somehow just fell away. It seems like every time there's a big crisis anywhere in the globe, we're just in the moment trying to figure it out, and we weren't ready for it at all. And we see this with diseases now all the time, too. Why is this not something that politicians are talking more about?
That is a great question. I feel that there was a pretty severe swing in American politics. In my mind, things changed a lot after Reagan took over. Obviously, there was still kind of leading up to that. There was a gradual decrease in preparedness, for lack of a better word. But I find that a large swing in American politics happened post-Carter and beginning of Reagan. And I feel like the tone kind of changed for both parties after that. And both parties have evolved, and the politicians are at a completely different type of standard now than they were before. And I feel like the quality of the issues being addressed by politicians has decreased, especially since that time, over time in general, but especially since that time. And it's really interesting to look at how that sort of evolved. It's kind of like Reagan. Reagan obviously had a pretty big effect, not just on the economy, not just on policy, but also with party. And I feel like Republicans 40 years ago would not be handling the climate crisis the way they're handling it right now, which is not at all. But yeah, I feel like there's been a dramatic shift in the type of politicians we put in and their priorities over the past few decades.
I think that's. I mean, I think it's absolutely true. I mean, we had these huge cultural shifts, and I think the average American's kind of relationship and level of faith in their government in the '60s and '70s, and two, I mean, we had these huge kind of cultural shifts in regards to how the average American thinks about politics in the '80s specifically. Um, yeah, it's impossible to think of like laying down a report on climate disaster in front of Eisenhower and him saying, "Well, we're not going to do anything about this."
Right, exactly.
Um, you know, so I mean, it sounds like you definitely are pinning yourself kind of as the climate candidate. Have you received any major climate endorsements that are kind of helping you, or are there any that you would like to receive that maybe you haven't?
Oh, there's a ton I'd like to receive. um, let's see. Actually, my first endorsement was from a slightly smaller organization called Climate Army. Um, and then most after that were other politicians, candidates, and a couple of smaller organizations. I haven't, as far as climate goes, I am meeting with Sunrise later this week. So I'd love to have endorsements from the Sunrise Movement. Obviously, I think they do fantastic work. Um, but yeah, we'll see what endorsements come in the next few months.
Sunrise is really a mind blowing organization, especially the fact that there's so much just youth leadership in it.
Yeah, impressive.
I feel like we're seeing that kind of everywhere right now. Um, is there's this kind of political Gen Z awakening that's occurring that is truly mind blowing. How do you think that's going to shape the future of politics in America?
I think Gen Z will probably end up being one of the most important generations, if not the single most important generation to ever live, if they can effectively turn out the vote, get in the right people, and address climate change. Because Gen Z, like you said, they've been incredibly active, they've been incredibly political, um, and they're them with millennials has now like combined the largest voting bloc in the entire United States. Um, Gen Z really has the power to do whatever they want and shape the future however they want. If they are able to effectively organize, which organizations like Sunrise show that they definitely are able to effectively organize, sometimes very often better than adults. Um, but if they are able to effectively organize and address the climate change issue, then I think they will be the single most important generation to have ever lived. They're very impressive.
I'm, as an organizer, when I'm recruiting, young kids. I mean, it's so different than it was when I was trying to recruit like other millennials like a decade ago. I remember, in the late 2000s, there was always like press articles about like, oh, millennials are the future. They're going to shape everything. Hope and change. They're going to get Barack Obama in and change the world. Like we did not. We didn't do it. Yeah, we got Barack Obama in first election. We were like, that's good enough.
Yeah.
I mean, we were apathetic. I mean, we still are. I mean, we got. I think there was this like kind of like forged in the fire moment for this generation that was like 9/11, Iraq, financial crisis, and I think collectively we're all just like, well, this is fucked. Let's move on.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a very like survivor, like individualistic mindset almost. Whereas you see Gen Z and it's a fight back mindset.
Yeah.
I'm blown away by it. I truly am. I have the most respect. Like the kids are okay. They really are.
Yeah. I went to I go to a lot of the protests, especially the climate ones, but this one I went to not long ago, it was the latest climate strike, and dude, it was like I had to at least have been like 80% of the people there were like 18 or younger. And I was just like, this is crazy. Like, this is being led by kids. Kids are like out of school for this. Like, these kids, like, they know their shit. They're doing their research. They know what's up with climate change. They're very aware, and they're actually doing something about it. One thing I think that might be one of the biggest differentiators between millennials and Gen Z. Millennials, when we were growing up, we were all fed the, go to the university or you'll never like make anything of yourself, get a degree, do this, do that. And we kind of did everything that we were told. And the crash of 2008 kind of like fucked everything anyway. And I feel like a lot of us were working or in school when that happened. And we kind of felt like the real time effects of 2008, of the housing crisis, the poor economy, the lack of jobs. Millennials are very, I feel, beaten down after having going through everything. So many events, so many bad events in such a short amount of time. And Gen Z kind of has grown up in this economic wasteland the way it is. And they're kind of like, hey, this isn't cool. Like, let's work to do something about it. And I feel like that's kind of their starting point, whereas millennials had to go through like years of trauma to get where we are now. And I almost wonder if that hasn't affected, or if that isn't one of the factors that contributes to millennial apathy.
No, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, so how do you mentioned earlier, I mean, if, millennials by themselves are, I think, are the largest voting bloc now. You throw in eligible Gen Z voters, and by far they are. But that apathy, it it's hard to fight back against. I mean, what are you as a candidate doing to bring in millennial voters? And I mean, what do you think that politicians across the kind of both the political spectrum and across the country, what can they do to get millennials involved and think that this is something that even going to vote is worth their time?
So that's a fantastic question and a fantastic topic. I really think for millennials, it really is about the fact that so many of us have been depressed and apathetic, and I have totally felt that. I totally feel that. And there's also a lot of independents and Bernie supporters who have been, I feel like, after the 2016 primary and the way that was handled, there's a lot of independents and Bernie supporters who felt like their vote didn't count because they felt like it was rigged. And I feel like you kind of have to move away from what's typical with millennials, because the truth is we don't like typical politicians. Like, we've watched typical politicians screw us for years, take us into wars that we didn't want to go into, get us into bad situations. And I feel like millennials have witnessed a lot of corruption in both parties, and that has turned them off. And I feel like one of the only ways to get millennials involved and to fight the apathy that comes with millennial vote or lack thereof has got to be about addressing the things that got us into those traumatic events to begin with. Because it was corruption, it was greed, it was capitalism, it was all these things. And millennials need to see those things specifically addressed, I feel, in order to get away from the apathy and get fired up to do something, even if it is just voting.
Well, I think the war is really, you mentioned that's a really huge issue for people of our generation. I mean, let's be honest. There's no one in our generation who didn't have a friend or a relative or someone who went, didn't like who went to Iraq. Everyone who is our age who wasn't rich knows someone like that, and someone who arguably probably came back and was very negatively affected by that experience.
Right.
It was defining, I think, for like our psyche. It was it's so different than like what baby boomers went through with Vietnam. Obviously, there wasn't a compulsory draft or anything like that, but there was a lot of shadows and of Vietnam, I think, to that war. Um,
Agreed.
I think that's why millennials gravitate, you know, towards candidates like Bernie Sanders. These candidates who are staunchly kind of anti-war. I think that's why we gravitated towards Barack Obama in 2008. I mean, he was, kind of the lone voice in those debates that was, had been vehemently against that thing since day
Right.
one. I mean, other than Kucinich and Gravel, but
Uh, yeah, I Obama honestly, like, for all his faults, he was a pretty decent president compared to a lot of the ones that we've had. But I feel like millennials have felt really screwed by the Obama presidency because we were sold hope and change and this really progressive outlook, and that's not what happened at all in either term. Um, and I feel like that was a huge hit to millennials and pushing for the progressive movement. But I do feel like Sanders has taken that sort of excitement that was there for Obama and like magnified it. There seems to be a lot of really aggressive support for him.
absolutely. I mean, I Sanders is a very different candidate than Barack Obama was in '08, but there are some parallels, and I mean, I think the youth enthusiasm is definitely one. I think the enthusiasm period and a sense of hopefulness that comes from their candidacy is definitely that. The flip side of that, though, is I mean, a lot of us that are more on the left, we're entirely disappointed by the Obama presidency. But the one thing I feel like a lot of people forget, I mean, that's kind of the nature of the presidency. Um,
Mm.
there's a lot of things that Barack Obama ran on that he did try to do that did not happen because the executive is in a dictatorship, and I almost have this like intrinsic fear that like we elect a Sanders and 8 years after that people are just as disengaged or just as feel like they got just as screwed when the reality is that much like Obama, Bernie fights his own party and the others, and he has to compromise. And the compromises maybe go further than Barack Obama did. Maybe they build off that. But there's this kind of issue I almost take when people are like, well, we didn't get the public option that he promised us in '08, or we didn't get card check like he promised us in '08. But it's like he definitely tried for those things, And how do you feel like the next administration can fight that? I mean, how do you think that they can try to push further on their goals and maybe explain to the people that they are fighting for them?
So first, I think it's pretty important to point out when we're talking about the Obama presidency is the Republican majority that he was up against. And I feel like he probably would have gotten a lot more done if, Republicans hadn't been trying to block him every time he was breathing. And I feel like we should almost learn from that and put everything we've got into this cycle to ensuring that not only Sanders is elected, but also a Congress that has the same vision as Sanders, because really that's imperative in our system if you want to legislate real change.
Yeah, I mean that's the issue is we need to take that activism and we need to move it down ballot. Especially in these kind of red to blue districts. And also, one thing I think that doesn't get discussed enough is state houses. There are so many state houses and state legislatures that are Republican controlled, but are barely Republican controlled. You're
Oh
talking
yeah.
one or two seats. That's all you need to win to change the balance of power there. Um, we've got to, whatever we do, whoever the nominee is, has to be someone that's focused on building coalition and building coordinated campaigns that will actually turn out results in those types of races.
I completely agree. And I think that on that note, one thing that Democrats have been getting wrong for a long time is that, yes, there are times when you have to compromise with the other party, but we could be focusing on flipping certain seats our way. And, you get more, it's kind of like you get more of your own in there, you have to compromise less. And we tend to focus as a party more on building a bridge with the GOP, which is harder now than ever, considering the Democrats are moving left and the Republicans are moving right. And I feel like a real path forward here, I think Democrats are going to have to start focusing on building the bridges with independents, especially progressive independents, because independents are determining elections. And that's what we need to be focused on across the board. Like, it's got to be more than excitement for a single candidate. It's got to be excitement for an idea that builds these coalitions, that builds these bridges, that builds a collective movement that can get things done across the country.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think there is one issue too that isn't focused on quite as much as I feel like it needs to be, which is we there are so many people who have complaints about the Democratic Party structure,
Mm,
but they don't understand how easy it is to get involved in that structure. We were talking about those big cultural shifts with Reagan earlier, but one thing that Reagan did is he went out all over the country after he was elected, and he convinced people that came to see him speak to go take appointments as precinct captains. It's the easiest, lowest level, public elected position you can have, and you can get it by appointment because there's so many vacancies. You can just walk into
right.
your party headquarters, fill out the paperwork, and you're in until the next election cycle. It's so minimal, but it has such a big impact radiating up in the direction that your party is going. Let's say you get elected. Do you foresee yourself as the type of congressman who is going to be back in PA2 regularly, doing things like that, focusing on getting people involved in the local party structure to steer the ship? Or do you see yourself as going to be the person who's going to be focused on implementing big policy in Washington?
So I feel like both are important. I feel like the reason a lot of politicians lose touch with their constituents is because they're chasing bigger things in Washington, which there's nothing wrong with that. It only becomes problematic if it becomes your only focus. And I feel like a lot of politicians are self-serving, and a lot of them focus on how can I leave behind this like big successful legacy. And the real focus shouldn't be how you can, leave behind a legacy, but rather how you can build effective movement and change. So I think I would want to be focused on both. I feel like it's really, really important to spend time with constituents, to be in sync with your constituents, and not to lose that, because those that's your community, that's your backbone. Those are the people that elect you. Those are the people that work with you. Um, and it's really, really important that they don't get left behind. So I would like to focus on strengthening the leftist organizations that already exist within PA2, um, and working with them regularly to ensure that there is large momentum going on, seeing how I can utilize my position as a congressman to benefit the organizations who are trying to do the groundwork on local levels, because, like you mentioned, they're very important. There's so many important um, positions that need to be filled. There's so many important things that need to be done, and the local level always seems to get ignored. And so I feel like that should definitely be uplifted, should be fed, so to speak, while pushing progressive policy in Washington.
I mean, it sounds like you have a desire to build structural change, and I think it sounds like you understand that you need to build a structure to do so. Is there a political kind of a leader that from the past that I don't know, take inspiration from, that you identify with? I don't want to use the word hero because that's beyond cheesy, but I mean, is there someone that you model yourself after at all?
Honestly, not really. I have, from what I've studied and from what I know, there are certain movements that I look to. Um, and it's really something that should be looked at, across the world. I feel like Americans have a limited perspective when it comes to not only how American political structure works, because it's not very well taught, but additionally, how movements across the world have affected their countries, how they've brought about change. Um, as far as I don't think I've modeled myself after any politicians, really, just ideas and just from living in the system and my experiences and seeing the experiences from people around me and wanting to address those.
I mean, it almost seems like maybe that's the attitude we should be like looking for elected leaders, people who aren't looking towards the past but are looking towards the future. And yet at the same time, you know, dropped a pen there.
I do it all the time.
At the same time, we see so much of the language of the past being, recycled. I mean, Green New Deal. I mean, it harkens back to the, maybe the largest seismic shift in American, modern American political history. Do you think that that's the right type of branding for these policies, or is that a mistake?
I think it's a good idea. Um, because I mean, really, the goal I think of politics is to look back at things that haven't worked, note that they didn't work, note not to do that again, and to kind of work with what did work and build on that. And I feel like we've done that as a species over time regarding civilizations. We've looked at a lot of what's worked in the past to build a foundation for what's currently being worked on. Um, so I feel like that's that's a good route to take, especially like with AOC bringing things kind of back to the New Deal, which is what she's essentially done is reinvigorated the same essence of the New Deal and brought it to modern politics. And I think that's extraordinarily smart because, FDR did a lot of groundbreaking. He did a lot of groundbreaking things. He changed the structure of the way that our system works, and that's essentially what AOC is talking about doing now. And I think that's incredibly smart.
It is. I like it personally. I mean, I think it resonates an idea and an ideal to Americans, and there's this issue with American nostalgia, right? Because so much of our past is frankly so horrid. Uh,
That's true.
but the flip side of that, I think something that a lot of people on the left forget, or at least don't want to accept, is that it is for the whole world. It is for the species. Like we are not great in large groups often,
Right.
and in that same time period, as we were committing some of our worst atrocities, we were, or at least perpetuating them still, we were also fighting against them, and we were fighting against even worse atrocities, around the globe. Uh, there is a balance there, and I think what AOC sometimes does is she's able to kind of carve out, you know, some of the worst parts of mid 20th century American heritage, if you will, and bring up some of the best. This idea that when we come together, we can achieve big things, that we can change the world, that we can work in unison with other countries around the world to prevent catastrophe. Um, is it an issue though to harken back too much? Do we need to constantly redress when utilizing those old messages that are positive? Do we need to also be addressing those kind of old fights that weren't so pleasant?
Um, I think at times it's necessary to address them. It kind of, I feel like that's very situational. Um, I do feel like there are certain topics that are very necessary to keep addressing, particularly like, for example, racism in the past was obviously um, highly acceptable, not only acceptable, but perpetuated knowingly in American history. And we've kind of, not kind of, we have grown away from that. You know, we've gone through a civil rights movement. However, racism is not dead. It's something that is still an issue. It needs to be addressed in a modern context. So I feel like it sort of depends. If it's something that's still relevant, yes, it should definitely still be addressed because not addressing it doesn't do anything. Um, but there are probably other things that aren't relevant that don't need to be rehashed. But
Well, and
I
I think this is an important conversation for those of us who are on the more progressive side of the Democratic Party or politics in general, because I think it's something that we're failing to really grasp at. And I mean, you look at the more progressive presidential candidates, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang. All of them have had issues with kind of so-called identity politics, or not paying enough attention to them, or redirecting again to just class struggle.
mm,
What can this newer group of leaders like yourself that are stepping up? How well, I want to say, what can you do? How are you trying to redress that? Like, how are you trying to make sure that you strike a balance between class struggle and identity struggle and oppression?
so class struggle. I feel like a lot of class struggle is okay. Let me say it this way. If we were to adequately address class struggle, I feel like a lot of other issues wouldn't be there, if that makes sense, when dealing with certain identities. Um, I know that for me, like as an LGBTQ person, I know that there are certain issues that pertain to my community that wouldn't necessarily be addressed through class struggle. But you're right in that there has to be a balance because you need to acknowledge marginalized groups and not only acknowledge them, but listen to them, um, also study them, find out what's happening in their communities, what needs to be addressed in their communities. Like for LGBTQ folks, a lot of what we deal with is discrimination. That's the basis of a lot of it. Um, we if there were certain federal worker protections, some of those would be off the table completely. So I do think that it's really important to keep focused on class struggle because if when you work for the worker, you work for all of them. And it's always important, I feel, to focus on that and to address that. But like you said, keeping a balance to also address issues that are disproportionately affecting marginalized groups, especially if those issues are ones that won't be addressed through um, tackling class struggle. But I feel like a lot of them are. They're interconnected.
Yeah, I think there's no way around the idea that addressing kind of these central kind of issues of poverty and opportunity will close many gaps. And and I think maybe the argument that isn't being articulated as well as it could be by some of the very top of the progressive leaders can be kind of summarized as these these attitudes that we can't legislate away. We can put protections in place, but maybe we can't legislate the actual bigotry out. But maybe we can create systems to educate younger people so that they are, I don't know, less bigoted in the future. But
Right.
I think there's some type of foundational conversation that does seem to be missing, especially with our presidential candidates right now. I mean, it's something they're criticized on fairly regularly.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, as you said, it everything's class, right?
Largely.
At least largely, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just bringing an old slogan back there. What are, I mean, kind of closing thoughts? What are the things that are, I think, most important to you to communicate? What are the things that you want people to know about yourself personally and as a political leader now?
So I think the most important piece is that I'm a working class person. I'm not someone who, you know, majored in political science and was groomed by politicians to run for certain seats or whatever. Um, it's not about a power game. It's not about leaving a legacy for me. It's literally about two big things. And the first one is, addressing climate change so we don't all die. And the second one is enabling the working class and empowering the working class and really trying to address that. It's a huge thing for me as somebody who grew up in poverty, um, because you life is different when you grow up impoverished as compared to what a lot of middle class people experience. There's a lot more struggles. There's a lot more stress, and living like that, I don't want anybody to have to live like that. I believe we totally have the means to ensure that nobody has to live like that, and there's no good reason that we're not doing that. So I think as a political leader, it's not so much of like, hey, like I went to school and I studied all these technicalities. It's based off of experience and living in an oppressive system and trying to do everything possible to fight back on that.
Salem, I can't thank you enough for coming on today. You know, please follow Salem, contribute to his campaign. Vote for him if you live in the area, or don't. It's America. That's your choice. But Salem, thanks again for coming on, and I look forward to being in touch in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me.